Hello there everyone, today's video is all about the taxation of a termination payment. Now, I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the general rule that certain types of termination payments, you get the first 30,000 tax-free, particularly around things like redundancy pay. Now, I'll do a separate video on what exactly you do get the 30 grand tax-free and what you don't, but this particular case, which went through the courts, I want to tell you about the outcome on this, which is a very interesting case indeed. Now, specifically, this is all about compensation payment. So, compensation payment. Here's the facts. Mrs. A, she basically was being sexually harassed by her boss, and she put in a formal complaint to her company, the line manager, whoever. The company formally rejected her claim and they said, no, that's not what happened. She said, okay, I'm now going to take you to tribunal, employment tribunal. But didn't get that far. So her employers said to her, look, we're going to give you £1 million to go away. £1 million. So £1 million settlement, as long as she withdrew her appeal to the employment tribunal and also signed a confidentiality agreement that she would not tell anyone about what had happened. So that's what happened. She got the £1 million. So how was that threat from a tax point of view by both the employer and by her? Let's have a look. Employer, £1 million payment to Mrs. A. So what they did, the employer, they said, oh, well, let's treat the first £30,000 tax-free. Coming back to what I said at the top of the video, termination payment. You get the first 30 grand tax-free. Right, so they then said the balance of £1 million, which is, I should be able to do the maths, 970 grand, they basically withheld PAYE on a payslip. So they withheld that. So she still ended up with many hundreds of thousands of pounds in her bank account, where there was a big chunk of PAYE withheld and first 30 grand tax-free. That's what the employer did. Now then, what about Mrs. A? Okay. So, she argued that £1 million was not earnings from her employment. She said it didn't derive from her employment, nor was it connected with her termination from her employment. It was neither of those two things. Instead, what Mrs. A argued was that the payment was made in agreement of her signing confidentiality agreement. That document that they made her sign, she said that that's what she received the £1 million for, with PAYE withheld on most of it, but £1 million gross. So she then said, because it's to do with this confidentiality and the fact that, it's nothing to do with my employment per se, therefore the payment should be outside the scope of tax. And on her tax return, she made a claim to get all of that 400 grand of PAYE or whatever it was refunded. Yeah, she said she should have got the £1 million gross without any tax deducted. Never mind the first 30 grand tax-free, she wanted the full £1 million tax-free. So that's what she put in her tax return. So HMRC got wind of this and they challenged it. And they said, right, two arguments we're going to put forward. First one is this, that the £1 million, the payment was connected to her employment. It was made by a former employer and it was connected to her employment. HMRC had a second argument. Often they do this in tribunals. They'll have to say, well, look, if that first argument fails, we're going to go down this second route. Second route being that the payment was for a restrictive undertaking, which in the tax law counts as earnings. So anything that's a restrictive undertaking, that you're paid to enter into a restrictive undertaking, you're taxed on that as if it was earnings. That's what the rules say. So, they're the arguments. Mrs. A, HMRC, went to tribunal. Tribunal quickly kicked out HMRC's first one and said, no, it's not earnings from her employment. It wasn't earnings. It's not like she had a salary. But the tribunal did agree with HMRC's second argument, which was this was a payment to enter into a restrictive covenant. Now, if you receive something for entering into a restrictive covenant, whether it's past, present, or future restrictions, that is taxable. And an example of a restrictive covenant is a confidentiality clause, which is exactly what she signed. So that counts as earnings, and hence it's taxable. Now, what's interesting is the whole lot is taxable, including the 30,000, the whole thing. So, employer paid it thinking 30 grand was tax-free, 970 grand taxable. She argued the full million tax-free. Tribunal said the full million fully taxable. Forget the 30,000 exemption. So she ended up having to pay tax on the whole lot. Anyway, she's still got £1 million, subject to paying tax on that. It's not a bad payout, but there you go. So, what is the takeaway from this? Well, compensation payments. Like I said, I'm doing a separate video on what counts, by the way, as your 30,000s, but compensation payments, what can be tax-free? She argued it should be. Tribunal said no, it shouldn't because it's restrictive covenant. If you pay someone compensation for personal injury, that typically would tend to be tax-free for the recipient. They would not pay tax on that. But that's pretty much the only thing where you get tax-free on the amount on as far as compensation payments. Like I said, I do a separate video on the more broader termination payments and what exactly you get your 30 grand exemption on. So just an overview there on a recent case which caught my eye. I thought I'd share that with you. If you like this video, please do subscribe. And as always, I'll see you soon.